and welcome to part 2 of the Bible for Grown-Ups. It's been good to hear how many of you have enjoyed part 1, so thank you for your feedback. Today we're going to begin in the beginning, looking at Genesis. And before you get too worried, don't panic. This is not going to be an argument for the 7-day creation story or against it. Those who know me well will know that when I've spoken about this, will know that whatever you believe about the timing of the creation stories in some ways is irrelevant. And it's an argument that we really don't need to get into with people. While most know some Bible stories, most people don't know the story of the Bible. Understanding how we got the Bible is almost as important as knowing what's in it. The backstory sheds light on the story. And part of understanding this challenge is knowing that the way we got our Bible is not the way we got the Bible. If you open a Bible today, any translation, you will see that we've got it all chaptered, versed, mapped and wrapped. It may surprise you to know it was not written that way. Yes, it is a collection of 66 writings, scriptures, texts that have been brought together to help us understand God. Nobody sat down and started writing it at the beginning, book 1, chapter 1, verse 1, and continued with it. It didn't happen that way. And the chapters and verses that we know today only came fairly recently, in the past 400 years to be exact. But in this exciting series, we're talking about how we got the Bible. Jesus didn't write it, but Jesus is the reason we have it. And as I mentioned in part 1, the story of the Bible begins when Jesus' tomb was found empty after his crucifixion. He was then seen alive and the church was launched. And from then on, the events surrounding Jesus' life were then documented. The documents documenting the life of Jesus are Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. And we can all agree that these are valuable, reliable, sacred and inspired. And over time, these 4 documents were eventually embraced as scripture. And even still, there was not a Bible, no text to paste a good sermon on. And Paul and the other disciples left Judea and took the message of Jesus, the message that they had seen, witnessed and believed in, and they took it to the Gentiles. And what we know that is the biggest transition for Gentiles embracing Christianity was coming to grips with the notion that there was only one God. One God. That was unimaginable. People just didn't convert from one religion to join another. They just added new gods to the altar and they collected them as they discovered them. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, Christians were considered atheists because they didn't believe in the many different gods. What was new, the message that the early disciples were sharing, was that they were adding a new one who claimed to be the only one God. It was novel and new. When Gentiles became captivated with a particular Jew, they became captivated with the story of Jesus and the sacred texts of the Jews known as the Torah, which then led them on to knowing about the law and the prophets. And these writings were the backstory of their new faith. And to their amazement, they discovered that the Jews, whose religion was older than the religion of the Greeks or the Romans, had always believed in one God, Yahweh. It had always been like this. For the Jews, just one God. The first line of the first section or book of the Torah would cause the ancient world to rethink everything. And it says, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. How could this be? In the beginning were the gods, surely, but this is singular, one God. Genesis is a word that comes from the Greek for origin, and Moses was the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament in the Bible. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeological discoveries created doubt around the origins of the Genesis account. And this was because the Egyptian, Babylonian and Canaanite creation texts were discovered, and they were very similar to the account found in Genesis. And this led to an initial assumption that the Hebrews had borrowed from other ancient creation stories. And this view has now been abandoned. Not only does Genesis not borrow from other creation stories and myths, Genesis stands in startling contrast to other ancient creation stories. Genesis is a worldview unto itself. It's an extraordinary, ahead of its time worldview. The modern scientific community didn't begin to catch up until 1927, when a Belgian priest first suggested the theory that you may have heard of, the Big Bang theory. It said the universe had a beginning, and this was a new concept, as since the time of Aristotle, about 320 BC, the assumption was that the universe had always existed. With the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation in 1964, the view that the universe always existence was virtually abandoned. And now scientists pretty much agree that in a trillionth of a second, the universe expanded with incomprehensible speed from its pebble-sized origin to astronomical scope. Or as we might say, quoting the words of Genesis from chapter 1, in the beginning. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. And the debate today is not how the universe or the planet was created. It is now whether it was a personal, purposeful, or an intentional cause. And if there was a purpose, what was that purpose? So when we look at the significance of what Moses writes, it's a bit lost on us, because what Moses was sharing is already assumed by us. Science has helped explain the Bible. Moses was building a case that's no longer needed because his argument is now ultimately succeeded by what we know through science. In Genesis, Moses is not trying to explain how God created the heavens and the earth. Moses was making the case that God, only one God, created the heavens and the earth, not any number of gods. It was just one. And Genesis 1 says, in the beginning, God created. God created. It was not created by Egyptians Amnari or Babylonians Marduk, who rode into an epic battle on the gods, with the gods on his horses, slaughtering everything in sight. According to Babylonian myth, Marduk defeated the goddess Tiamat by shooting an arrow through her mouth, and afterwards he split her body in half, and he created the heavens with the upper half, and her body created the earth with the lower half. Sunday school must have been so much more interesting for Babylonian children. Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis is nothing like the Egyptian, Babylonian or Canaanite creation myths about how they created themselves from body parts and fluids. And this brings us to the next epic ahead of its time notion. The Babylonian creation story, also known as the Enuma Elish, and begins with when and high, and states that the human race is created to serve lazy gods. After becoming chief among the gods, Marduk says, I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name, savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. In the Babylonian creation story, the human race was an afterthought to lighten the load of the gods. And consequently, individuals had no rights, hope, or intrinsic value. The violence and injustices of the gods justified the violence and injustice of human rulers because they were acting like their fathers in heaven. In stark contrast to this, and without parallel, we find in Genesis a concept that the human race continues to wrestle with today. And in verse 26 it said, then God said, let us make mankind in our image. And in the Jewish text, mankind is the pinnacle of creation. Dignity is established in the beginning, and this was unheard of. Humans were made in the image of God. Boom. There was no parallel anywhere like this in any other faith creation stories. And what came next was also unimaginable, because it says in our likeness that they may rule over, not worship or idolize, but rule over. And they rule over the fish and the birds in the sky and over livestock and all the wild animals. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Only recently has civilization caught up with the extraordinarily value ascribed to men and women in the beginning. We get distracted by the timing and the sequencing of the creation account and miss the magnificence of these early statements. Moses dropped a bomb. This story, our story, is radical. It's a revolution and unheard of before Moses introduced this different, unparalleled and untested worldview. It's a rule not reflected in nature or even in human nature. According to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, you were born a slave to serve the gods. There was no redeemer or afterlife. And now, when we look at today's new atheist, the thinking is still around being a slave to something. Today's atheists believe that you were born a slave to your DNA, with no free will, no redeemer or afterlife. Moses was sharing and writing in Genesis about a God who created with a purpose and likeness to God himself. Genesis 1, in the beginning. Moses introduces them and us to a God who saves, redeems, delivers, and never gives up on us. God gave us freedom to choose, and he honours our choices. And then he does the most ungodly thing imaginable. He went to work to reverse the consequence of humankind's decision to choose against him. And Genesis 1 provides us with a meta-narrative, the big story and the ultimate context for human experience, a monotheistic worldview. And it's a worldview that answers the most important questions of life, the why questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why are you here and why does it matter? You're here on purpose. With purpose. You're not the result of a cosmic conflict between the gods. You are not created by the universe. God wanted image bearers who would know one another and him. And when the time was right, he joined us. But back to the first Gentile disciples of Jesus in the 1st century AD, as they looked at the opening line of the Hebrew Bible, and they realised that the Jews had it right all along. And this only fueled their interest in the law and the prophets and moved them quickly to accept and adopt the Jewish text as their own sacred scripture. And thus the stage was set for the inclusion of the Hebrew Bible into our Christian Bible. However, that inclusion was not without its difficulties. But we'll pick that up from next week. So please don't miss episode 3 next week of the Bible for Grown-ups. I really hope you're enjoying the series and I look forward to seeing you next time. So go in peace and God bless. Amen.